In this video, we're going to look at some 12-mark questions and think about what they might look like for the Crime and Punishment unit in paper 2. Here are some example statements that you might be asked to evaluate. I would suggest that you pause the video here and have a look through, maybe choose one or two to do a bit of a mind map and think about how you would approach them. Some of them are quite tricky, so I'm going to go through two of these and explain how you might approach them. With all of your 12-mark questions, a good structure is key to writing a good answer. So I'm just going to remind you of how we set it out. These are the sentence starters that you should try and memorize. And the key structure is that you begin with the view that you disagree with, so a weak argument, which you're then going to criticize. You then move on into the second part of your answer to your viewpoint and give a strong argument for that. You still need to make sure you're considering the opposite point of view, so consider a criticism of your argument, and then you'll need to respond to show why that criticism isn't valid. In each of these little sections, you need to obviously be developing your ideas as much as possible, making reference to Muslim teachings, to quotes from the Quran and the Hadith, and so on, and explaining why they're important. So I think this is a particularly tricky statement. So be aware you might get these kind of statements in the exam, and it's worth thinking how you would respond. So Allah should act according to human ideas of justice. So this kind of raises a question about the way we as humans think about justice, and then the way Allah is seen to act in the world, and whether it's important that Allah always acts in the world in a way that humans can understand and see as fulfilling human ideas of justice, or whether it's okay if Allah sometimes acts in ways that don't fulfill human ideas of justice, that might even look on the surface of it to be unjust from a human point of view. So arguments in favor of this statement is that we already have a sense of justice. We feel that certain things are right and wrong, things perhaps like murder, those sorts of things. So that if Allah was to act in a way that looked like Allah was murdering or allowing murder, then we'd think that Allah was acting unjustly. So Allah should always act in a way where humans can kind of see and understand that he is acting with justice and fairness. The second point kind of develops this a bit more, the idea that justice is a fundamental moral value, and that we wouldn't be able to understand Allah if he was to act against that. And we'd, as I said before, we'd consider Allah to be acting in a way that even goes against the laws that he's given for humans to act in terms of justice. And then the final point is that if Allah is always acting according to human ideas of justice, then it means that we can understand Allah and his actions. We can relate to Allah better. He's less kind of mysterious, if you like, so that humans can connect with Allah. If Allah's values were different, and if he allows things to happen that he tells humanity are wrong, then that could kind of lead to confusion. Muslims might worry whether Allah is going against his own laws. So these are some of the reasons in favor of Allah acting according to human ideas of justice. I think, remember that Allah is known as the Just. It's one of the names of Allah. It's perhaps worth thinking that on this side of the argument, you might think that Shia Muslims would be more inclined to this. They see the idea of divine justice as very important. And you might remember that they reject ideas of predestination of al-Qadar because they see that wouldn't make sense in terms of justice, and so that would kind of fit in with the idea that Allah should act according to human ideas of justice. Arguments against: we could say that humans have an imperfect and limited understanding of justice that just can't be compared with Allah. Allah is acting according to his divine knowledge and wisdom, which goes far beyond human comprehension. When you think about, say, the problem of evil, there was that image that we talked about of kind of being an ant in a rug and not being able to see the bigger picture. Allah can see the bigger picture. What looks unjust to us may actually serve a greater purpose. Another thing that Muslims might kind of worry about this statement is that human ideas of justice can change with society as society evolves, and as society evolves, those ideas of justice are not always in line with what Allah has commanded, and so in fact they would be, those changes in society would be wrong. Allah's justice is kind of true and eternal and unchanging. So sometimes Allah's justice might look strange or different from human justice, but that's because humans have got it wrong, some Muslims would argue. And then thirdly, Allah is not bound by human ideas, human concepts or opinions, because he's guided by a divine wisdom which is far kind of superior, is kind of perfect, whereas humans is limited and subjective and changeable. So also we might even say that Allah, being kind of infinite and perfect, has a kind of a different standard of justice to what applies to human ideas of justice. And I think just as the Shia Muslims might tend to support the argument, perhaps Sunni Muslims might be more inclined to go against the statement and again think about how God has a plan, his al-Qadar, his hidden purpose of his decrees that we might not fully understand. Perhaps when we're rewarded and go to heaven, then we might be able to understand them then, but in this life we may not be able to understand fully how Allah does act according to true justice, even though Allah is not acting according to human ideas of justice. So what I've done is just take you through those points to help you understand them. I'm going to leave you to kind of choose which ones you think are the most important points and whether you'd argue for or against. And once you've got your ideas together, looking at those arguments for and against, do rewind the video if you need to have another look. Once you've got those ideas, use the structure that we've gone through. There are lots of videos I've already done explaining how you take each bullet point and convert it into those sentence structures. So if you are a bit lost, go back and watch one of the earlier ones. But I'm going to leave this now for you to try and take those ideas and create your own 12-mark answer following the structure. So pause the video here if that's helpful, or rewind and have a look at the earlier arguments so that you can answer this question. Okay, I'm going to have a look at a second question as well and just go through some of the arguments you might use. So on this statement, it's no one should ever be subject to torture. So we'll have a look at the arguments for and against. You can see them set out in bullet points here. You can obviously pause and have a think about what they mean and choose the arguments that you think are relevant before having a go at answering this question. Let me go through the bullet points though and explain a little bit about what they mean. So on the first one, for the arguments in favor of this statement, Allah being the creator obviously loves what he's created. What he's created is good. So he expects Muslims to respect humanity that he's created and therefore treat everyone equally. All humans are equal and they should be treated that way and with compassion, as Allah himself is merciful and compassionate. So those kind of arguments could be used, perhaps specifically the ideas of forgiveness as well and compassion that we've looked at in the course. Muslims may also think that there is good evidence that torture is not a good way to get information from, because prisoners who are being tortured, they are perhaps more interested in stopping the torture than telling the truth. So they'll say anything that they think the torturer wants to hear, rather than actually giving them accurate information. So that torture may not be very useful. So that could be given as an argument against using torture. And then a third reason is that ultimately God will be the judge. So even if the person being tortured, maybe even they deserve to be tortured in some sense, but that justice should be administered by Allah and not by humans. So this perhaps also refers back to the previous question about human ideas of justice and divine, that it would be wrong for humans to torture another human, but it might be right for Allah because he knows everything and knows who would deserve that and who wouldn't. And it might be that Muslims would consider that they are usurping. That means kind of taking over Allah's role in torturing people. So there's some thoughts against. Make sure you're referring to Muslim teachings, like I've mentioned, like Allah being compassionate, quotes from the Quran, and so on. Now, arguing against the statement. Here we can bring in some moral theories. So do look carefully when you've got a statement like this. There'll be a set of bullet points that will remind you that you must refer to Muslim teachings and you must reach a reasoned conclusion. But it will also sometimes say that you should use ethical theories or moral theories, in which case you really need to make sure that you know some moral theories. You can talk about situation ethics. You can talk about utilitarianism. I think both of them would work for the first bullet point. So situation ethics is doing the most loving thing. I suppose that you could actually use that against torture, because you'd say that torture is not a loving thing. But you could also suggest that by torturing someone who is guilty, then you might be able to save lots of innocent lives. So I think here, if you're going to argue against the statement, you need perhaps a good kind of scenario or example where torture could be justified. So maybe there's weapons or bombs that is going to go off and kill lots of people, or there are hostages involved or something like that, so that in torturing one person who perhaps we already know is guilty in some way, we might save lots of innocent lives. So then it would be the most loving thing to do. Or in terms of utilitarianism, it would bring about the greater good, and so would be justified on that basis. Similar point, I think the next one is that Muslims may suggest it's less damaging morally to torture one person, even perhaps an innocent person, if you're saving the lives of many. So maybe this might fit a bit more with utilitarianism, that you just have to weigh up the damage that's done. Yes, it's bad to torture one person, but you're not killing them, you're saving lots of lives, so maybe it's a good thing. Again, a good example to help bring that through. Maybe it's to do with terrorism, which is the next point. Maybe it's to do with bombs, something like that, where many lives are at risk. So then the third one is, again, to do with terrorism, that terrorism is something really, really terrible. And in that case, torture may be allowed, perhaps particularly where the situation is time sensitive and you need the information as quickly as possible, perhaps to prevent a future attack. Another thing that you might add that's not included here is that in the Quran there are certain punishments that could be considered as a form of torture. So when someone steals, the Quran says that they should have their hands cut off. That could be considered a form of torture because it involves sort of extreme pain. There's also lashings, kind of being beaten or whipped for certain crimes. Again, that could be considered a form of torture. So it might be that some Muslims would think that justice requires torture in certain circumstances. Again, the crimes would need to be quite severe, and the Quran also requires very high levels of evidence to make sure that you know that the person truly is guilty. But they may be reasons as well to go against this statement and say that torture may be required in some circumstances. So pause here, have a look through, see what you think about those arguments, select the ones that you think are most relevant, and think about whether you'd argue for or against this statement. Again, once you've done that and you've selected your arguments, you're looking really for, as the outline suggests here, you're looking for 2 arguments that go against your view with 3 arguments that support your view. So you're weighting it slightly more in your favor, obviously, but do make sure you develop and explain as well as possible the arguments that you're going to go against and that you're going to criticize. Then it's also about linking the arguments together, so trying to see them in a particular order. So you've got a weak argument, and then your argument should act as a kind of criticism of that weak argument. So you need to kind of link those together. And then again, the next section, you have a kind of sandwich where you have your strong argument. In the middle, you have a criticism of that, but you've got a response ready to show why that doesn't work. And also that's important that you're kind of ending on your point. So you kind of begin on the point that you disagree with, but you're ending on your own point, and that helps give a good, clear, and strong conclusion that's kind of quite persuasive. So pause the video here if that's helpful to use the structure. Maybe you've got the structure in your book, and try and take the arguments that you selected and convert them into the structure there. And as I mentioned before, do look at earlier videos if you are struggling with how that works. Thank you very much.